Yeah, thanks, Pranav. Um, yeah, okay. So I think first things first, I'll just start with an overview of the report for everybody. So the way this report was conceptualized was that we thought of it as a tool to help policymakers who are looking to understand how to regulate private crypto assets in India. And another thing we also wanted to mention, given the reports or the conflicting reports of the government first introducing a bill in this session and then changing that earlier today, what we've decided to do is release the report as a working draft so that we can incorporate, if there is a bill coming out, any analysis of that bill. And also, we're opening it out for public consultation. So if anyone has any feedback, please reach out to us through the webpage. The webpage for this report will be linked in the chat by Pranav. With that, Pranav, could you just move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, thanks. Okay, first things first, many people on this call would be familiar with the term cryptocurrency or cryptocurrencies. That term is often used as shorthand to describe the various types of technologies and products that exist in the crypto marketplace. But actually something that we wanted to do with our report was be a little more specific, right? Because cryptocurrency, at least the way we see it, refers to a very specific form of specific crypto product. So in our report, what we've done is we've decided rather to have the report be based around crypto assets, right? And because we feel like this definition and the word crypto assets better represents all the technologies and products within the crypto space. So just for everyone's context, we define a crypto asset as a digital representation of value or any contractual right that uses some form of distributed ledger technology and which is secured cryptographically. It's also based on the definition that is provided by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. So again, that leads to a really obvious question, which is what is DLT? Really simply put, DLT is a system of making electronic records. That is, it's an electronic ledger of sorts that is distributed across several computing entities, which are called nodes. What makes DLT different is that it does not need a centralized authority to share records or to verify their authenticity. So what that means is it's a decentralized system. And another term that gets thrown around with DLT a lot and associated with crypto assets a lot is blockchain. So blockchain is just a form of DLT where the records of the completed transactions are stored in a chain of blocks, and the chain grows continuously as new and new blocks are added to it. Pranav, could you just move on to the next slide? Yeah, so we just had a very brief background on what crypto assets are. In the report, we sort of identify 5 proposed use cases for them. The first one would be as a method of payment. So if you look at like when crypto assets like Bitcoin were envisioned, they were envisioned with the idea of operating as alternatives to existing means of payments like the dollar or the rupee. So as alternatives to existing currencies. So that would be the first use case. The second one would be as a tradable asset. So that would be assets that can be traded similar to like how one might trade a stock or a security. The third use case would be something called an initial coin offering or an ICO. This is when a company issues tokens or crypto assets in an attempt to raise capital. And the tokens that they issue often have some benefits associated with them. For example, it could be early access to a product. And these benefits are meant to incentivize individuals to purchase the token. We then have crypto asset funds and derivatives. So, entities may provide investment funds and derivative products with crypto assets as their underlying asset. And finally, what we've looked at is also crypto-related services. So these are businesses that are indirectly linked to the crypto space. So you'd see things like a crypto asset, escrow accounts, or crypto exchanges under this definition. So with that, I'll just hand it over to my colleague Aryan, who will take the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much. Before we delve into, if we can move on to the next slide. Yeah. So before we delve into the regulatory landscape on crypto assets in India, in order to understand the overall outlook, I would like to briefly touch upon the benefits that are associated with the use and adoption of crypto assets, particularly private crypto assets, along with some limitations that they possess. So starting with the benefits of crypto assets as a form of currency, these are very well known generally and have been expanded upon in detail in our report. The first of such benefits are that the transactions associated with crypto assets are decentralized and are verifiable. Secondly, the costs associated with such transactions are reduced or even eliminated in some cases due to the absence of traditional intermediaries. Moreover, crypto assets provide an enhanced level of confidentiality and increased security due to the use of public-private key cryptography. Additionally, while definitely raising regulatory challenges, crypto assets facilitate easier cross-border transactions for both individuals and for businesses. And then, arguably, their decentralized nature also facilitates financial inclusion among individuals who do not have access to traditional financial services. Now, our report also highlights the benefits of crypto assets in their use as assets, such as NFTs, that can provide a significant value to digital creators. Now, if we can move to the next slide. Yeah. So now we'll also look at some limitations of crypto assets, firstly, in their use as a currency. The foremost limitation that is widely raised is the environmental impact that is associated with high energy consumption involved in crypto asset mining. Then it is also argued that costs associated with traditional systems will now be replaced by new costs, fueled by the growth and need of third-party intermediaries. While being decentralized, crypto assets lend themselves to centralization through the creation of systems where mining and consequently supply is highly concentrated, leading to dominance by a few actors. Other limitations include the inability of crypto assets in replacing traditional money systems due to their volatility and the issues associated with scalability, and the subsequent monetary policy challenges that arise with their widespread use. Now, finally, it is also argued that the widespread use of crypto assets is hampered by a lack of network externalities and infrastructure, and thus it will have a very, very limited impact on financial inclusion. And in their use as assets, the limitations associated with crypto assets are their increased usage in illegal activities and their susceptibility to scams owing to their unregulated nature. Having discussed these briefly, it is also pertinent to mention here that many of these limitations can be addressed, and the risks that are associated with these can be mitigated through adequate and prudent regulation, as will also be discussed in the later part of this presentation. Moving on now to the policy aspect, we look at some institutional positions that have been taken on cryptocurrencies, particularly in India. Firstly, we look at the position taken by the Reserve Bank of India. Now, as we know that the RBI has been at the forefront of the regulation debate in India and has consistently taken a very cautious approach to cryptocurrencies, starting as early as 2013. It has released several circulars, notifications, and press releases warning consumers of the risks involved in investing and trading in cryptocurrencies. And in April 2018, it even prohibited RBI regulated entities from facilitating any virtual currency transactions. But this circular was quashed by the Honorable Supreme Court in March 2020. Another important development was the report of the Interministerial Committee on Virtual Currencies, which was constituted in 2017, and it submitted the report in July 2019. The report advocated a complete ban on cryptocurrencies, but the draft bill that was included in the report never actually made it to the parliament. Speaking of the parliament, the government has also over the years answered many queries related RBI's position. The government has maintained that, firstly, they do not have any record or collect data on any aspect of cryptocurrency transactions. And secondly, that they do not plan on recognizing or currently recognize cryptocurrencies as legal tender. It has also been clarified in the past year that the government is in the process of formulating a legislation, the details of which are unclear and, of course, have been subject to a number of speculations too. Finally, with regards to ministries, in a press release in December 2017, the Ministry of Finance issued a statement echoing many of the concerns posed by the RBI. And then in March 2021, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs also released a notification mandating that companies disclose their cryptocurrency holdings in their balance sheets. Now with this, the institutional positions on crypto assets have been covered, and we will now be moving on to their legal status and our recommendations on ideal regulations. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Aryan. Thanks for that. So I'll take you guys through the regulatory part and the recommendations of our report. So in the regulatory chapter of our report, what we've done is looked at the definitions of some of the key financial instruments which crypto assets are usually compared against, and see whether crypto assets would actually fall within these definitions. So we've looked at currency, we've looked at money, foreign currency, security, derivatives, commodity derivatives, collective investment schemes, prepaid payment instruments, payment systems as well. And the key takeaway is that except under certain specific circumstances, which we've listed out in the report, crypto assets would not fall within any of these definitions. And therefore, under Indian law, the most plausible definition for crypto assets would be as movable property or even as goods under the Sale of Goods Act. This now brings us to the main thrust of our report, which is the recommendations of the report. Pranav, can we have the next slide, please? So our recommendations have been divided into interim measures and long-term measures. The interim measures are measures such as avoiding a ban on crypto assets, the government reiterating that they are not legal tender, and also using the existing regulatory authorities such as either the SEBI or the RBI to assume jurisdiction over crypto assets to impose certain minimal regulations such as KYC and anti-money laundering regulations, just till the time an independent regulatory mechanism is put into place. The SEBI can assume jurisdiction by either declaring crypto assets as derivatives under the SCRA or even as collective investment schemes. The RBI could also do it by declaring them as derivatives or as a payment system, but the RBI doesn't even need to do that because the Supreme Court has already recognized that the RBI has jurisdiction to regulate crypto assets if it wishes to do so. We then move on to the long-term measures. The first long-term measure that our report has suggested is that owing to the unique nature of crypto assets, we need to have a standalone regulatory mechanism for crypto assets. The rest of our recommendations deal with what this regulatory mechanism should contain, or at least the main points that it needs to cover. The first would be a clear definition of the main terms such as crypto assets and crypto entities. The definition of crypto assets basically needs to be wide enough to be future-proof, but shouldn't be too wide so as to cover the underlying technology itself. It might also make sense to classify crypto assets into different categories based on their functions, and such as payment functions, investment, utility tokens, stablecoins, and tweak the regulations to suit these functions so as to have a more efficient regulatory regime. Our next recommendation is to introduce a licensing system for entities engaging in commercial activities in the crypto sphere, something on the lines of the BIT license in New York State. The license would have certain conditions such as minimum capital requirements, minimum data security requirements, certain consumer awareness and consumer protection requirements as well. Our next recommendation deals with the environmental concerns on crypto mining. We've suggested considering a Pigouvian tax to offset the cost of negative externalities linked with crypto mining. The government could also look at the use of certain restrictions on mining activities, such as geographical restrictions or even the use of renewable energy for these operations. The next recommendation deals with consumer protection measures. We've suggested certain consumer awareness campaigns, ensuring that marketing material is clearly marked as such, and it clearly articulates the rights and risks associated with this sort of an investment. And there should also be some minimum transparency requirements. So on the entities dealing in the cryptosphere, so that management structure and conflicts of interests have are properly disclosed to the investors. We then try to address the issue of volatility in the crypto market, but we've recognized the fact that due to its global nature, it's not possible for any one state or any one government to take enough measures to address the volatility in the market. Therefore, the measures that we've suggested aim to reduce the risk to the greater economy from this volatility. So there may be, the government could consider limitations on risk exposure to the cryptosphere for key financial institutions. And on the same lines, it could even consider limits on trading volumes of retail customers to ensure that retail customers don't bear the brunt of any meltdown in this market. We then moved on to another recommendation, which was of an oversight body. In an ideal scenario, we would probably have an independent oversight body which would have jurisdiction over crypto assets and would have expertise in the crypto space. However, due to resource restrictions and the practicalities of governance, we realized that it's more likely to be one of the existing financial regulators who would have to assume control. The two regulators which we feel would be most suited to this role would be either the RBI because of the currency and exchange control angle, or the Securities and Exchange Board of India, the SEBI, because of the investment and consumer protection angle involved. We've also recommended that the taxation of crypto assets needs a bit of clarity, because a lot of people are confused as to whether any profits from crypto assets would be shown under the head of income or would it fall under capital gains. We feel it would be the latter. When dealing with the indirect taxes, on the other hand, commercial entities would, such as crypto exchanges, would probably have to be subjected to service tax for the fees and commissions that they charge under the GST regime. However, because crypto assets themselves can be classified as goods, there is a small technicality where it's hypothetically possible that every single crypto transaction would be liable to GST, considering if all the other conditions such as registration and turnover limits are satisfied. Our last recommendation deals with stablecoins. Stablecoins, as we all know, are used as a means of exchange within the crypto markets. They are slightly different from traditional crypto assets in that they derive their value from an underlying reserve asset. This exposes them to an extra risk, which is the risk of the underlying asset losing its value, which is generally the case when the underlying asset is a non-zero risk asset, which would be pretty much any asset except for a particular currency. Therefore, we've recommended imposing certain quasi-banking regulations in order to mitigate this risk on stable coins. This would be over and above the general regulations that would be applicable to them as being a crypto asset. That, I think, brings us to the end of our presentation.
Thanks, Vipul.
Oh.
Thanks, Vipul and Arvind. That was incredibly informative, especially the recommendation section. Just quickly before we move on, I wanted to address a question we got in the chat. And the question was about whether we would deliberately narrowing the scope by using the term crypto assets as opposed to cryptocurrencies, simply because some crypto assets can be termed as, can function as currencies. I think, and that's a great question, and something that we were thinking about at the very beginning of writing the report. And what we saw is that across jurisdictions internationally, there was a move away from classifying cryptocurrencies as cryptocurrencies and rather terming them as crypto assets. And it was less about narrowing the definition and much more about broadening it. So what jurisdictions are seeing is that crypto assets need not function only as currencies, right? Like something that was envisioned as a currency, something like Bitcoin, might also function, for example, like a speculative asset. So what we decided to do was then use this umbrella term of crypto asset, under which one of our recommendations is to classify the different kinds of crypto assets. One of those could be, for example, a cryptocurrency, something that would function similar to a currency. But just want to make it clear that we weren't actually narrowing the scope, we were attempting to broaden the scope by using the term crypto asset. With that, I think we can move on to the panel discussion. First things first, I just wanted to introduce all the panelists and also just thank them for taking time out to be here. So first, I'll start with Tanvi Ratna. Tanvi is the founder of Policy 4.0 and an expert on blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Previously, she was blockchain lead at EY, where she handled government and enterprise projects. And for her work in blockchain policy, was awarded a prestigious fellowship at the New America Foundation in Washington. Tanvi, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Next would be Prashant Irodaraj, who runs the R&D group at ZepPay, which is focused on applying distributed ledger technology to our most pressing challenges. Prior to this, he helped launch Keep Network, which is a privacy-focused decentralized protocol for public blockchains, and has been in the crypto space since 2015. Prashant, glad you could join us.
Thank you, Aman.
All right, and our last external panelist is Shahnaz Ahmed. Shahnaz is a senior resident fellow and fintech lead at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. She has worked with several ministries on matters relating to digital payments, financial regulation, commercial laws, and business and human rights. Her research focuses on leveraging technological solutions to build a robust and inclusive financial system in India. Shahnaz, thanks for being here.
Thanks. Looking forward to this discussion.
And our final panelist and our main in-house panelist is Vipul Kharbanda. Vipul is not only a co-author of the report, but is also a non-resident fellow at CIS, focusing on fintech. Vipul is a lawyer by training and has a background in corporate laws, privacy, jurisprudence, and fintech. Finally, my name is Aman, and I'm a policy officer and fintech lead at CIS, and I'll be today's moderator. With that said, I think we can just jump straight in. As I've mentioned to all the panelists before, feel free to jump in the discussion anytime. I would like this to be incredibly conversational. So I think I'll start us off with a question or a prompt even. So, what we're seeing now is that we have all these conflicting reports coming out, even ones today about, the government's changing stance on regulating of private crypto assets. But something that's they've maintained consistently, and something that the RBI have maintained consistently, is that while they may be sort of wary of crypto assets, is they are sort of fans of blockchain technology, right? And that they would like to promote blockchain innovation. So Prashant, I'll come to you. Given the current landscape, do you think it's possible for India to realistically have blockchain innovation without crypto assets?
So the short answer is you can't really have the innovation without the crypto assets or the value transfer mechanisms. And obviously the space is only the beginning. Crypto assets are the tip of the iceberg, and it's something that we all interact with. And yes, it's a little bit like the Wild West. 90% of it is scams, and there's a lot of, pump and dump. But the value transfer mechanism that it represents is core to many consensus mechanisms that drive the decentralization of the space. And this decentralization is important because this is the next phase of the internet. This is where we move from the big centralized companies like Google and Facebook to products and services owned by the users themselves, which is a very new mental model for how services on the internet can be owned, operated, and used. So the analogy, a very simple analogy I would give is we are kind of moving from a feudal society in tech, where a few people dominate, to a democratic society. And blockchain and distributed ledger technology is kind of like the printing press. It's enabling democracy, right? It's enabling a much more equitable internet. And a core feature, a core mechanism that drives that is the crypto asset, because it drives the trust and the lowering, and it lowers the cost of trust in the system. right? So people are more likely to engage with each other in an anonymous way across continents without without this financial transfer mechanism or this value transfer mechanism that prevents misbehavior. That's difficult to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And then, okay, so
sorry, please.
And yeah, so the second part of it is in India, I think, yeah, so we definitely need to consider that when we create these regulations. And I think the Indian ecosystem would be if the regulation is too constrictive. Like I think one of the examples that Brian Brooks gave to the House Congressional Committee when he was in the U.S. when he was presenting was, when we transitioned from horse-drawn carriages to cars, Britain overregulated, and every time you drove a car, you had to have three people: a driver, the passenger, and then someone in front to wave a red flag, right, as the car moved forward. And that's just insane when we think about it now. So we need to be careful that we don't do that to crypto.
Right. Yeah, that makes that makes a lot of sense, and I think you did some interesting points about like the required mental shift from like the existing thought models we have around financials and financial regulations, and how crypto changes that. So I mean, just picking up on a point that you mentioned on not going too far on regulations, right? Like that seems to be a consistent worry across academia, across industry, across individuals who are interested in crypto, right? And now that we know that the government's most likely going to move away from a ban on crypto assets, we're sort of trying to figure out how they can regulate it while still allowing for innovation. And I think one of the proposed methods by which they could do this is through the introduction of a nationalized India wallet, right? And Tanvi, I'm going to come to you here, considering all the work that you and Policy 4.0 have done on this. Like, do you see a nationalized wallet similar to something that may function in El Salvador? Do you see that as being a feasible solution and a feasible light model for regulation in India?
Yeah, thanks, Aman. I think there's been a lot of confusion, I think, around this India wallet idea. I mean, it's not. We're not really recommending an El Salvador type model. It's more like a standard, you can say. It's something. I think if we'd call it a crypto passport, that might have made more sense. Because this could very well be your existing decentralized non-custodial wallets, right? It could just be your MetaMask or your Trust wallet or other wallets that people use. It just goes through a certain authentication process, right? And the whole premise of this regulation was to say that this whole recommendation, was to say that we, these are bigger debates, and I think you guys have tackled it well in your report, of defining these assets and giving a token classification. And, these are longer questions that, no country is really resolved from the get-go, right? And the countries that did make frameworks are all revisiting them right now because the technology itself has changed so much. So if we are stuck on the form factor question and we are trying to understand just, define everything, predefine it. Like you said, we're trying to regulate it looking back on what we already have as existing regulation, right? Then we are going to get stuck in quagmires, right? So let's start with some first principles. And there, one of the fundamental things is that crypto assets are just keys. It doesn't matter what form they take, whether they're an NFT, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's Dogecoin, whether it's a gaming token or anything, any form that it takes now or in the future. It is just going to be a key pair. And if you first think through the pragmatic question of how you can ring-fence this, then it makes your job easier in terms of then plugging in different regulators and figuring out which one fits better into a security framework, which one fits into a commodity framework. And then, you have existing frameworks, as you also mentioned in your report, you do have existing frameworks that can potentially apply, right? And then you can start fine tuning it. But then if you're making very harsh regulation where you're trying to funnel everything, for example, there was thinking, even in our recent discussions at the ministry, there was thinking of like funneling all the activity into certain channels, and that's very difficult because a lot of the activity now in crypto is decentralized, and so the real threat or the real challenge, but also the real opportunity you're trying to address, lies in decentralization, and it lies in DeFi, and it lies in the next wave of innovations that are coming out, what you call the Web3 or the metaverse, all these concepts, right? So if we are trying to protect innovation in India, then our regulation can't just address what's there, what was there yesterday, right? It has to be prepared for what's coming. And so for that reason, we recommended, the government look at the wallet level, because that's why it doesn't matter what part of the crypto sphere you're entering, you are going through a wallet, right? So we have not, made a recommendation of whether it should be a national wallet or it should be something. That's not the level to which we have recommended. I think those are next level policy questions. But what we did recommend is in terms of the concept of the regulation that you're taking up, phase it out, start with the ring fencing, start with the basic legal frameworks that you put in place, and then start building capacity and building out the other regulations, right? But it is easy to create a ring fence, like technically that's possible. And I think today also there was this roundtable where we had, we had members of the RBI and FinMin and all present at that discussion. And I think this concept is being understood. And I think without thinking like this, we might just regulate piecemeal parts of this crypto ecosystem. We might just shut the door on some things and then open the door on other things, and then you're just distorting the potential of this economy.
Yeah. I think you raised a lot of really interesting points, vis-a-vis like sort of the future-proofing of regulations and sort of like, again, not being left behind, right, essentially. Shaz, I want to come to you. So I think both Prashant and Tanvi have sort of raised the need for regulation to both be innovative friendly and be future-proof. I think that raises the very obvious question on who this regulator is going to be, right? Like, so obviously, so we expect, certain entities to have a say in any future crypto bill that may come, but there will also be entities whose function it will be to consistently regulate crypto activities going in the future. And I think, we've had conflicting reports about whether it's going to be the RBI or SEBI. And as someone who works on the policy side of crypto, like, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on what kind of entity could be the one to take the lead on crypto regulations.
Sure, thanks, Aman. So I think before I answer your question, I think it's also important to understand how the financial regulatory architecture in India is structured. So I think the way it works is that we determine the nature of the financial instrument, and then we have a regulator looking at it. And this is very different from how perhaps UK works or from how Singapore works, where we have like a unified regulatory architecture. So it's easier for them to determine, which will be the concerned regulator looking into it. So I think to answer this question first, I think that is why we'll have to understand how do we want to classify cryptos to the extent it fits into the definition of existing laws, to the extent that there are certain tokens which exhibit features of existing financial instruments. Perhaps it may be sort of kind of taken care of by those existing laws, and there concerned regulator will look into it. But the problem is that most of the crypto assets that we see today do not really have an underlying asset, and perhaps will not really fit into any existing definitions, which you have already mentioned. So for that, obviously, we need to think of a bespoke regulatory framework. Now, the question then comes is that which will be this regulator who will look into it? Considering, I think, the kind of activities that we are looking at, since we don't really have an underlying asset, we will end up regulating the service providers in this case, which might be your exchanges, which might be your custodial service providers. So from that perspective, I think SEBI perhaps is a better regulator because of the fact that they have experience in market conduct regulation. And that's the kind of regulation perhaps initially that we will sort of look at when we are regulating this sector. Now, having said that, but we cannot think of a regulatory framework where RBI doesn't really have a role to play because of the fact that they will, you will have financial institutions which have exposure to the market. You will have cross-border transactions, and then again the rise of stable coins. So all these issues will also mean that this regulatory framework that we are looking at also has a role for RBI, at least from perhaps, from a financial stability point of view, from a cross-border transaction point of view. But perhaps the lead is where SEBI can take the lead in the market conduct regulation part of it.
Thanks, Shahnaz. Yeah, I think that's, you raised some really interesting points in terms of regulations going to be focused more on sort of the service providers than the underlying asset, which I think, would to some extent be a novelty, right? I think, now that we've sort of all discussed how we think, sort of the founding principles of regulation, right? What I would like to do is sort of just focus on some of the key, let's say, concerns that government may have, and sort of focus on, how, do we address regulation that can still ensure innovation, can still ensure that, the Web3 revolution moves forward while still sort of accounting for these concerns. So Vipul, I'll come to you first. I think, at a very obvious level, one of the most widely cited concerns with crypto assets and crypto assets trading is the impact in the environment. So, and I think, as we move from COP and whatnot, and as climate change becomes a more pressing issue going forward, how do you think governments should address this concern while still allowing for crypto assets within their society?
So, Aman, we've actually looked at this in the report, as you know, and environmental concerns are the environmental issue is actually a much more real concern, especially that's an issue we've been thinking about since the initial interministerial committee report came out, which I thought focused too much on the volatility and other aspects of cryptocurrency and the fact that they don't have underlying assets. Those are things I thought were not real concerns, but the environmental issue is definitely a real concern, and that is why we've recommended a regulatory regime to counter the damages from crypto mining to the environment. As I mentioned in my presentation, one could be a tax, a pecuniary tax on crypto mining. And, we could look at taxes on things such as smoking and alcohol and tobacco to sort of guide this, the implementation of this regime. The other option could be that, or these could be parallel options. The other thing could be using renewable energy in some way, ensuring that the bigger crypto mining projects have restrictions where they could be either completely off grid, or they should have a net zero metering requirement where you use smart meters to ensure that they give back the same amount of electricity into the grid using renewable resources as they've taken from the grid.
Thanks, Vipul. Yeah, I think those are some great recommendations. I think I just wanted to open up this question up to the wider panel also. And I think maybe we can start, Prashant. I think you might be best placed to answer this question. I think a lot has been made on the environmental concerns, and there is a school of thought that is emerging that a lot of the environmental concerns can be sort of mitigated depending on the use of on the consensus mechanism that you use, right? So I think one of the worries now is that since Bitcoin is the predominant crypto asset and since it uses a proof of work mechanism, that's why we have to deal with the environmental concerns. Do you, or and so to anyone on the panel, do any of you see like a future where we all sort of collectively move away from POW systems and that would solve the environmental concerns?
Yes. So I'll first say that the proof of work in Bitcoin that uses a lot of energy is a feature. It's not a bug. And that actually creates a lot of security in the system. And proof of stake systems, while they do provide, they're still not as good as a proof of work system, right? So you do lose some amount of that, and you have to kind of add additional elements to the consensus mechanism to prevent misbehavior. But as we move to proof of stake systems, yes, that energy consumption will go down. For example, your refrigerator, the little computer in your refrigerator may be able to participate in the consensus mechanism using very little energy. Another way, so if we did want to use a proof of work system like Bitcoin, a place that regulation might help is, and this is something that we've done, we've created this thing called Solar BTC, is if it mandates that corporations and the government who will eventually buy crypto assets only buy assets that are generated using renewable energy and verifiably generated using renewable energy, and potentially for the Indian government, verifiably generated using renewable energy in India. The great part about Bitcoin and any of these assets is that because they are traceable, if a miner can verifiably prove that they exist in India and are using solar power or renewable energy, you know for a fact that that Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever was generated using that. And then any corporation or government that wants to be responsible can say, look, we're going to buy this. Or if the government can create a rule and saying that, we encourage some rules that encourage corporations and government entities to buy renewable energy generated assets as opposed to fossil fuel generated assets.
Yeah, I think that definitely at least seems like we're moving towards a future where maybe proof of stake is at least one solution towards the environmental concerns. So just moving on from the environmental concerns, I think another big concern that was mentioned and sort of very much highlighted within the interministerial report and has been subsequently highlighted by the government and the RBI is the concern that, because of their nature, because of the sort of quasi-anonymous nature of crypto assets, that they could essentially become tools for facilitating illicit activities. Shahnaz, like, how do you think governments can deal with this concern going forward?
Sure, thanks, Aman. So I think for most countries, when we look at the first point of regulatory intervention has actually been through this anti-money laundering framework. And that is why we have seen how the Financial Action Task Force has also come up with its guidance on how these service providers and assets, how the anti-money laundering framework needs to be structured to account for these developments. So I think even in India, I think there are 3 points essentially when you raise this issue. One is from a regulatory perspective, when we are perhaps designing the law for crypto assets in India, we'll obviously have to think about sort of an anti-money laundering framework for regulated entities, which would mean that service providers, which are the first point of contact for investors or consumers into the sector, needs to be regulated, needs to be registered, needs to be authorized for carrying out these services. Once that is done, I mean, you will have to sort of impose obligations in relation to customer due diligence, risk-based customer due diligence, which will also mean your know your customer requirements. You will have to impose requirements relating to monitoring of transactions, reporting mechanisms. So I think this is more or less how the anti-money laundering framework works for financial entities. So we will have to sort of devise some framework for that in the law that we are thinking about. So I think that's the regulatory or the legislative part of it. The second bit, I think, is more from an enforcement point of view. Now, we can have multiple laws. I mean, we can design multiple regulations to sort of regulate this sector. But the point is that the nature of this particular sector and any sector which deals with emerging technologies is that it becomes difficult for law enforcement agencies. So I think for India, that will mean that we have to ramp up our institutional capacity, regulatory resources and capacity, insofar as enforcement mechanism is concerned, to the extent if it requires creating a specialized task force, for dealing with these kind of enforcement actions. So I think that's the second bit. And third, I think, which I think a lot of us have been talking about, and a lot of experts mentioned, that is the area of international cooperation, because today, at the end of the day, effective regulation, supervision, enforcement of any activities in the crypto asset will require a sort of a global approach, a global coordination mechanism. And for that, India, that might mean either through bilateral arrangements or through multilateral forums. So I think these are the three areas which I would say would be critical to sort of design a framework to prevent illicit activities through crypto assets.
Thanks, Shahnaz. Yeah, I think that again raises some really interesting points in terms of how governments want to think about this going forward. I think we could just move on to some of the audience questions, because there seem to be a lot. So I'm just going to pick out a few. I think the first question, and I'm going to direct this to Tanvi, because you work very clearly at the intersection of blockchain and government, is what your views were on just the idea of regulating crypto in the first place, considering that it was meant to be a parallel system that was outside the purview of government oversight. That was a question from Deepak.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a common discussion I have with a lot of the folks in this space as well. I mean, I think till you build a new world for yourself where it's ruled by a completely different set of norms and it doesn't have this history of civilization and rules and institutions, till then you are going to have to find ways to work within this system, right? And I think crypto is, I think it is as much a technological movement as, we can't be blind to the fact that it is also a political movement in a way, right? And I think, I think it's, bringing in changes already into a variety of things. I think the whole usherance into CBDCs is not something that would have ever happened if Bitcoin had stayed at $100 or, so I think that there's a lot happening there, but I think it's very unrealistic for people to expect that governments have any interest in protecting a cypherpunk manifesto's tenets, or they have any responsibility to protect decentralization. They do not, and I think that's just the hard truth that people really need to understand. So yes, it may not have been built for regulation, but there is no way it will not be regulated.
Yeah, thanks, Tanvi. I think, we just have to sort of accept the material reality we live in, right? I think it's probably just the point. I just want to move on to another question from the audience, from Parminder. And he mentions that so maybe people might probably take this one. He mentions in our report that we list one of the functions of, one of the classifications of a crypto asset as a means of payment. And so does that mean we're sort of advocating that crypto assets are a currency? Vipul, I will hand this over to you because it will lead into another question I have about stablecoins. But I just want to clarify when we say in our classification, and I think this is a distinction that often gets not accurately represented in crypto discussions, is that there is a distinction between an entity or an asset that acts as a currency and an asset that is recognized as legal tender. Right. So in our report, I think what we talk about when we talk about as a means of payment, we're discussing stable coins as they pertain to the crypto ecosystem, how they function within the crypto ecosystem. I think what we also make very clear is that we don't think that a stable coin should be legal tender, in that it should not be recognized by the government as a means of exchange. So you can't go to a shop and be obliged that they accept your stable coin. So yeah, Vipul, actually that just brings me to the question that I had about stable coins. We've seen a rise in attempts at regulating stablecoins in the US, in the EU, most recently a few days ago in Japan, right? So given the unique nature of stablecoins, how do you see their regulation going forward? And do you think it's an important thing that government should focus on?
Yeah, I think the The short answer here would be, without going into the technicalities of stablecoins, the short answer would be that I see an added layer of regulation or an added layer of protection for stablecoins, because there is an added risk in their inherent nature, in that there needs to be regulation to maintain the value of the underlying asset. Because if the underlying asset loses its value, that will cause a major loss to the investors. So, and that is something that can be addressed through regulations, because we've been doing this with banks for centuries now. So, I mean, for years, maybe not centuries, but we have been. So, I think that is one very important aspect for stablecoins. They need to have all the other regulations that would be applicable to crypto assets, but there will have to be this added layer for them as well.
Yeah, thanks, Apal. I think, yes, just something I wanted to add on that as someone who worked on it. The report is that I think you're seeing the general consensus across the globe now moving towards like treating stablecoin issuers almost like you would treat a lending financial institution. And those are sort of questions that I guess the Indian government should be thinking of. Tanya, I just want to come back to you again. A lot of the discussion and sort of leading on this from the stablecoin discussion, there are concerns about, the volatility of crypto assets and the impact that they can have on the wider financial market. Again, it was something that was very clearly highlighted by the Interministerial Committee and has been highlighted by the RBI constantly. As someone who's in these rooms having these discussions, like how do you like sort of quell some of the fears that they may have, and how do you sort of see the impact of crypto assets on the wider financial market?
Yeah, I think the first thing to understand is that we can do nothing about crypto volatility, right? It's really not something that's in the hands of RBI or the entire country of India together cannot stop the volatility of these assets, because this is a global market. It has no circuit breakers. It trades 24/7 in every country in the world, and there is no single regulator that can or might for the foreseeable future really clamp down on it in every jurisdiction. So it will remain volatile, and I think the only what we can definitely do is ring fence the risk, and so that's why our idea of this wallet actually works very much like a depository, right? So it sort of ring fences away from the financial system. And it creates a sort of dedicated institutional structure around these assets. And I think you do need something that's very ring fenced from the rest of the system. Otherwise, there will be spillover. And I think that's the next step in this. But this is very similar. I think the infrastructure we built or talked about does aggregate into that sort of an institution.
Yeah, I think that again, like I think the idea of rent pricing, and as you mentioned, I think governments around the world should just be focusing on like limiting the impact of the volatility on the wider markets instead of just trying to fix the volatility itself. Prashant, I just want to come another question at you. So over the last few weeks, we've had sort of these reports that have been coming out about what various elements of a crypto bill could look like, right? And I think one of the things that we're consistently seeing is that, or at least we saw initially with the NDTV reports, was that the government was looking only to allow for the use of Indian wallets that are managed by recognized exchanges in India, and to not allow for the use of private wallets. While we can discuss the regulatory side of it, I want to understand from like a technical perspective, like, do you think that that's actually a feasible, it's feasible to enforce such a move from the government?
No, that is not feasible. There is no central. There's no central. If you're looking at a decentralized system like Bitcoin or Ethereum, there is no central entity to go after to say, please shut down these wallets, right? Anybody can create a wallet. It doesn't take a lot to create a wallet, and you can store your private key in a diary. You can store it in a password manager. You can store it. You can just memorize it. There's no obvious way to say, hey, I have a wallet and I'm storing crypto, right? There's no way to say, if you look at a regular person in the street, there's no way to tell that person is storing crypto. So you can take down the entity that's generating the wallet. You can obviously tell if someone's using a wallet. So it seems infeasible. Another kind of like example that I will use as a comparison is BitTorrent, which governments around the world and uh, companies have been trying to shut down for 20 years now. A lot of the underlying technology is very similar, and they have been unsuccessful in doing it. They've used various legal methods. They've done various things, but it's still going and it's still going strong.
Yeah, yeah. I think the comparison with torrents is like a really interesting one, right? To think of, like, considering how, I think what was it, sort of the mid 2000s when you saw like the big push, mid 2000s, you saw the big push towards regulating torrents. Pirate Bay was a big thing. I think now maybe we're just seeing sort of like the same discussions evolve around crypto assets. Just again, going back to some of the questions in the chat. Shahnaz, I'm going to come to you with this one. So this is from Pradhan, and they ask, how do you think SEBI and RBI and the RBI will deal with the inherent conflict of interest with respect to regulating the crypto sphere?
So I think, as I said, we'll have to obviously kind of carve out the areas of regulation for them. So as I said, I think SEBI would essentially look at the market conduct part of it, the market conduct regulation part of it, whereas I think RBI will essentially be responsible from the end of from a financial stability or the prudential regulation aspect of it. Primarily, it will be SEBI, but as I said, because to the extent we have financial entities having exposure to the crypto asset markets, you will have to give RBI some power to issue regulations and directions so as to sort of protect or minimize those kind of exposures, as well as also from a cross-border perspective, like in case there are FEMA-related foreign exchange-related implications. So again, that is where I think RBI will have to sort of come in, and accordingly, powers have to be given to RBI to issue directions under these laws.
Thanks, Shahnaz. Yeah, I think I think it's going to be really important to draw those like lines and the distinctions between which jurisdictional body has control over what. Just going on to another question from Angelina. Will we have Indian coins and international coins kind of categorization, and what regulations will be coming up around this? So, I mean, Tanvi or Vipul, maybe one of you could take this, or anyone, but in our report, we've advocated for a purpose-led classification. Do you see any merit in having a geographic classification?
Yeah, I'm not sure that makes sense. I mean, these are decentralized networks. So, I mean, yeah, the founder might be Indian, but like the users will be anywhere in the world. I think maybe you could think of some framework around like mining concentration. Maybe that's a way to give it a geographical kind of lens, but I don't think that makes sense. But yes, you can have like domestic transactions versus foreign transactions. So that is something that we have put forth in that white paper, which is up on our website on this wallet-based kind of approach. You can sort of put some ring fence around what's cross-border, what's domestic, because I think that's very important, especially for countries with capital controls. That was also one of our major motivations for drawing out something like this, was we can't really look too many examples. There's not much to draw from in terms of how we can tackle capital controls, how we can tackle exchange rate risk and things like that. So it's for that purpose that I think that sort of infrastructure, as like what we proposed, will let you at least differentiate what's within your borders and what's outside to a great degree, right? I mean, there's always like ways around.
Yeah, I think you've summarized that perfectly. I think, just the decentralized nature sort of limits the idea of doing it geographically, right? Vipul, I was going to come to you with another question. So this is from CK Ramachandran, and they say taxing crypto on the lines of cigarettes and alcohols would make crypto assets a sin good. So you recommended a Pigovian tax, and I will jump in here a little later as well. You recommended a Pigovian tax. Do you think this would make it a sin good?
No, not necessarily. I mean, just because there is a high tax on something doesn't necessarily make it a sin good. And I think perhaps the examples that we've taken is what has prompted this question. Uh, so the simple answer is that I don't think it would make it a sin good at all. This is just we're just looking at a tax regime where the tax is extremely high on a particular good for a particular reason. It happens to be that for tobaccos and cigarettes and alcohol, these are sin goods, but you could also look at luxury items perhaps as as a guiding influence.
Yeah, I think you've said it perfectly. Like, I mean, Pigovian tax, like in econ textbooks, the definitions you get are cigarettes and alcohol, but like it can completely be on something like cars. Like foreign cars is a great example of a Pigovian tax. And also, just I think what we want to make clear is that when we were discussing the Pigovian tax, it was on mining, right, and not on crypto assets as a whole. So, for example, if you were trading a crypto asset, we don't really recommend having a Pigovian tax. It doesn't make sense, right? Whereas if you're going to set up a mining farm in a regional community where the electricity grid might not be designed for that, then it probably makes sense, right, to have some form of accountability structure. Cool. And so, okay, one more, I think, audience question. I just want to get the entire panel's idea on. So, a lot of the discussion we've had has been around, sort of like maintaining the innovative environment that currently exists around crypto assets. So, AR wants to know what all your views are on China's ban on crypto assets and its impact on Chinese innovation, both in the short and long term. It's open to anyone.
Okay, I guess I could come in here. I mean, we have done quite a lot of work on China on its CBDC project and looking a little bit at the ban they have. So I mean, China has had many cascading bans, and they faced a lot of issues with all of them. And I think even now with the mining ban, like there is there's just people one switching into proof of stake mining, which is like not as detectable as proof of work, and people are masking it as industrial activity. And there's a lot of collusion from state governments who earn quite a bit from this. It's not a very easy thing to take down. But what it means on innovation, I think, will depend somewhere also on the future of cryptocurrencies itself. I think now you're seeing globally a lot of the regulatory net is tightening, and it's set to sort of tighten substantially in the US and other places. So people said a lot of this about China and the internet as well. When China sort of shut things down and had its own internet, and everybody said they would not have they not benefit from the internet, they won't have tech companies, and now they have like some of the largest ones in the world. They have like 100+ unicorns and things. So I would really hesitate on these future prediction sort of things, because I think there's just too many dynamics at play here.
Yeah, I think the parallel you draw with the firewall and how China's innovation in the tech sphere has blossomed is a good one. Does anyone else have any thoughts that they may have on it?
Well, I mean, I would say that it may stifle innovations that kind of like the rest of the world uses. Like, I don't see something like Ethereum coming out of China. Because if it is contained, and if it is that kind of a system where it's a walled garden within China, maybe there'll be innovations in terms of the fundamental technology, but if it's a technology that then crosses borders and people around the world use, a lot of that depends on the people around the world trusting that this is a truly decentralized system, and it's not a system that's just owned by the Chinese government. And I once again want to say that the main innovation in the space is reducing the cost of trust and allowing people to collaborate across borders. So that's really the innovation that may be stifled if China with this ban. I don't know about the details of how it's playing out right now, but just from a first principles, that seems to be the case. right? I don't think an Ethereum type system will come out of China and dominate the world.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think maybe that is something as people working on crypto in the future we'd have to sort of think about, right? Like I think historically the innovations that have come out of China and then done really well in the world have been either as alternatives for services that have existed in the world outside of that. So you think something like WeChat as being an alternative to something that existed before, right? Or you look at like TikTok as being sort of like an alternative to social media that it didn't have and then just happened to take over the world. It'd be interesting to see sort of if the same thing happens with blockchain and crypto, or whether there would just be this sort of gap in sort of Chinese innovation. With that said, I think we can just move on to another question. And fair warning, this one's a little long. And so the question again for all the panelists is, what do you think that the incentive for a user is to put money up for a crypto-powered project? If crypto services are to be truly decentralized, you would need a large number of people being vested in the project. But often it's difficult to determine if a crypto project proposition will be successful or not, since you need investment upfront. Do you think that other than the niche set of crypto enthusiasts who understand the sector, the average public is possibly okay with centralized platforms and may not actually want to put their stake in crypto project? And this one's from Arpit Gupta. So any of the panelists, feel free.
Yeah, I can take that. So I helped launch Creep Network, which was a decentralized platform, and it is hard to bootstrap a new crypto platform, and the only people who understand it are other crypto enthusiasts and developers. It is hard right now. But I'll once again use the analogy of the smartphone, where if you were around 20 years ago and you saw a smartphone, you'd be wondering, how many people in the world would actually use this and understand how to use it and know how to use it. And young people even in rural India right now are using smartphones and doing things with it that we never imagined they would do. So I would say in the short term, yes, it is still a very developer, crypto, math, nerd, geek focused industry, but it will proliferate, and eventually people will learn to incorporate it in their lives, just like they have every other technology.
Tanvi, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I think there was a two-part question here, right? One is in terms of getting users, and the other was in terms of, who will invest into these coins, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, is that the question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I think one of the major innovations of crypto is in that process of getting users, right? I mean, that's why I think that at least the early folks, and I think Prashant and Zebi were also one of the early folks. I remember them from my early days at EY as well. That was one of the reasons it was exciting before there was a metaverse or Web3, is it solved that problem of you bootstrapping and getting to a certain phase. It sort of really cut into this whole VC nexus that was there, right? And now it's interesting that now there's a new VC nexus in crypto, right? And you have things like Solana and all that, which are very different. But I think so it actually solved for that problem. And I think as far as like people putting money in coins, I mean, look around. I mean, that's what people are doing, right? So I mean, everyone's on the lookout for the next coin, and everyone wants to get in when it's early. And so now you have all these decentralized listings and things which don't go through. I mean, centralized listings also don't go through any rigor. And I think Shinaz is right that that definitely is one of the first things to fix. But the decentralized listings are even less. I mean, sometimes there's barely a prototype, or like so I think I think the user problem and the capital problem are actually the things that crypto has solved over other kind of technologies.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tanvi. Shahnaz, I just want to come back to you, going back to some of the sort of regulatory questions that we wanted to look at. So in the report, we sort of analyze a few license systems that have been either proposed or deployed across the world. So we look at sort of New York City, we look at the EU's proposed registration system. And I think one of the recommendations we make is around, the Indian government considering something like this, considering that they don't already, collect data on crypto assets. Maybe a licensing system might help. As again, someone who sort of works very closely in the regulatory field on this, do you think that a licensing system would make sense for a country like India?
Sure. I think a sort of I wouldn't really call it a license, but perhaps a sort of an authorization, a sort of a registration mechanism works, because I think otherwise it's difficult to sort of, you may create regulations or laws, but it's difficult to sort of implement that unless you have like a specific entity. And in the case of cryptos, as we said, we don't really have, there perhaps the entry points will be the service providers who will essentially be the triggers, or who will essentially be the entities which we sought to regulate, at least in the first phase of our regulations. So I think a sort of an authorization framework and works well for regulation.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, yeah, perfectly said. I couldn't add totally everything to add. Vipul, I think I just want to come to you. Again, another consideration that we might think of is consumer protection, and something you mentioned in the presentation as well. How do you see governments effectively implementing consumer protection, sort of given the nature of the crypto market space, and sort of given the existence of scams and worries around that?
So, as far as consumer protection is concerned, as Shanaz mentioned, she mentioned that SEBI is probably the agency that should have jurisdiction over crypto assets because they've got experience in market regulation. I think they've also got a fair amount of experience in consumer protection measures. So you could mandate consumer awareness. Advertisements should have proper disclaimers, perhaps not the kind that mutual funds have, where the guy just rattles it off. Perhaps something slightly more robust. And I think the consumer protection regime in India itself is fairly robust, leaving aside the fact that the courts are completely overwhelmed with case laws and pendencies. That apart, I think the laws themselves are fairly technology neutral. So as long as the actual fraud is being perpetrated within India and within our borders, even the enforcement mechanism is fairly robust to take care of this.
Thanks, Vipul. Yeah, I think that again, I think it's the existence of the current mechanism, and sort of maybe there's lessons to be learned from other jurisdictions that seem to have, the EU comes to mind, that have clear ideas on how consumer protection should be done. Okay, I'm going to just come to again all of you with a question from Vinay, and I will just be paraphrasing this simply because it's quite a technical question. If you guys want to refer to it, it should be in the question and answer section. So I think Vinay's question relates to sort of the co-opting of the crypto movement by the platform economy. And I think his question runs around where we see scope for a larger conversation on making the payment settlement industry more accountable in terms of the underlying financialization implicit in their business models. And also, how does this conversation regarding public and private infrastructure evolve in the light of the politics of CBDCs? So, Shahnaz, I know that you do a lot of work on sort of ideating on the financial systems that we have. So maybe you'd want to go on this.
Sure. I think, of course, I think this conversations around crypto assets also bring to us, given that there are certain elements of it, or perhaps even the usage of this technology in the payments system is also concerned. Of course, I think brings us a lot of issue insofar as how do we want to kind of see these technologies being implemented at the payments level, and how do we make this more accountable. But I think right now, from what I understand, is that I think this is an evolving sector right now. I don't want to sort of preempt and say that this is the sort of framework that we need, at least for crypto. I mean, I wouldn't say cryptos, but perhaps blockchain, DLT, and payments. I wouldn't really kind of say that, this is the framework that we need to sort of build more accountability. I think this is at a stage, at least in India, we are at a stage where we are still trying to understand the use cases and opportunities. So I would kind of put it at there. Insofar as I think the second question, insofar as CBDC is concerned, I think it's quite interesting because I think the rise of stable coins, the rise of crypto assets has essentially sort of brought in this whole conversations around central bank digital currencies. And I think for India, I think the question is, and this is something that we have also encountered because, when we did our CBDC research, a question that always came to us is that why, I mean, how is the CBDC infrastructure or a public infrastructure around CBDC going to work in India, where you already have so much investment in a private infrastructure? We already have a payment mechanism here. We already have payments infrastructure. How does this work along with that? So I think for India, definitely, I think interoperability is an important issue when we think about public-private infrastructures. How does that work in the context of CBDC? And secondly, also, I think CBDC, I think we should not look at it in a silo, because I think globally also when you look at CBDC conversations, it has moved on. The CBDC is just going to be an underlying infrastructure. You are going to have private entities build upon it. So I think CBDC is also going to, one of the objectives is to sort of promote innovation in the payments sector. So we will definitely be, in fact, looking at perhaps public-private partnerships insofar as the CBDC deployment is concerned. So I think that's sort of my thoughts.
Yeah, Prashant, Tanvi, Vipul, any of you have thoughts on the question?
I sort of lost the chat, so could you just tell me the question again?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So Vinay's question was about the co-option of the crypto trust by the platform economy. And he talks about where does the panel see scope for a larger conversation on making the payment settlement industry more accountable in terms of the underlying financialization implicit in their business models. And he also wants to know how does the conversation regarding public and private infrastructure evolve in the light of CBDCs?
That's a wonderful question. I think the financialization of everything, I think that's, I've seen a lot of thoughtful people, even in the crypto space, talk about it. I don't have an answer for that, but I think that is one of the actual questions, that's going to dictate just how fair and free and, just how good this economy becomes. I think about public-private collaboration in the CBDC space. Yeah, I mean, this typically in other countries, this starts early, right? It starts from the time of, thinking through the CBDC, and there are lots of pilots done in collaboration and things like that. So that's unfortunately not, that's not the way that at the moment things are happening. But I think from next year onwards is when we would start seeing some collaborations. I think possibly the second half of next year is when I think things will have more concrete shape. And then, then I do think there will be talks of this. I think the payments infrastructure, I think people in India are quite proud of the payments infrastructure. So I know there are issues for like fintech firms with, the kind of, I think what we haven't really cracked is the economics around it, right? And I think that has really sort of skewed things for the fintech guys. But I think as far as payments infrastructure, like if you go into any policy frame, discussion and talk about upgrading the payments infrastructure, it's like sacrilege. I think like it's not something you should be saying. So but I think I don't really have many answers for this, but I think these are wonderful questions.
Prashant, I saw you on mute.
Yeah, I think so the public-private partnership, I think the payments infrastructure is a good example. And yeah, I think Tanvi's right, it is maybe not great to question the Indian payments infrastructure, which is quite good and relatively modern compared to other countries in the world. And I think where the collaboration may happen is the global is integrating that into a global payments infrastructure. So it is possible that systems like Ethereum or other decentralized systems that, or layer 2, layer 1 systems that come up may plug into the existing payments infrastructure and allow for value transfer in a secure way around the world, which you can't do right now with the Indian payments infrastructure. You've got to go through multiple hops and have multiple intermediaries. And there's not, I think there's not a lot of transparency. I think even in the Indian payments infrastructure itself, there's not a lot of transparency. And maybe that's the part where I know we call it private blockchains and public blockchains, but I call them public blockchains, which is a blockchain that's decentralized. Really adds a lot of value is that transparency that even government systems don't provide right now. So I think I don't know why anyone hasn't asked this question yet, but I'm still confused as to why blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin are being called private blockchains. And maybe that's indicative of the complete mental model change that's kind of required to understand the space.
No, actually, it's an FATF terminology. So, I mean, even they call it that. So, it's not, I always thought it's something invented here, but it's really not. I mean, basically anything non-sovereign is private.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's straight out of political science and econ, like you would call public infrastructure anything owned by the state, right?
Well, maybe that's something that we need to rethink as we go forward, right?
Right.
It is, what is public in the modern context?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think like maybe you just given me like a research idea. So I think we have time for one more question, and so I think we will address the one by Parminder, the last question. And I guess this is again directed towards Vipul and me. So it seems like government is looking to ban cryptocurrency as a currency, not just making it legal tender. Do the report authors have any, or panelists have anything to say about this? Vipul, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, so I'm not very sure if the government is planning to ban cryptocurrency. I think from what I've heard in reports, they're planning to ban usage of crypto assets as a payment mechanism. And frankly speaking, from not from an academic or technical point of view, but purely from the point of view of the number of people who have invested in crypto assets, I don't think that will make a huge difference to them, because I think the way crypto assets are used in India is primarily as an investment and not as a means of payment. So I think that's a safe way that the government is trying to take, where they don't disappoint too many people, especially the younger generation, as they did with the ban on PUBG, perhaps. And I think this also helps them create the sort of walled garden that they're looking for, and reduce the exchange control risks around crypto assets. So I think that is why we are hearing that the government is planning to ban the use of crypto assets as a means of payment.
Yeah, as Vipul said, I think that more or less sums it up. I think the only thing I would add is that, I think Parminder's question, like it sort of identifies a gap in, again, the way of thinking between maybe how government is considering crypto assets as of now and like how they actually function around the world. So again, like thinking of it as sure, just a currency, right? And a currency being something that's akin to the rupee, and the only thing that exists is the rupee it is kind of not how crypto works, because like we said throughout this thing, you have stable coins that have developed as methods of exchange within the crypto world, right? So maybe this is just one of those instances where government, as we recommend, like should focus on crypto stablecoin specific regulation, find a certain way to classify them. So while they may not fall within the current definition of a currency or legal tender, they, you sort of recognize the function that they perform within the crypto space as a method of exchange. I think with that, we're more or less done. I think we have 4 minutes left, so I think we just end a little early. I once again just want to thank all the panelists for giving us their valuable time. I have learned a lot from this discussion, and will definitely be taking a lot of what we learned here forward in our research. I just thank all the people who have attended the event as well. If you would like to see the work of any of our panelists or our work, we will be sharing their work on CIS's social media. Thank you once again, everybody. This was a great discussion, and we hope you have a good evening and a good.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.